4 p.m., stand up. It's count time. Time for every man and woman to stand up and be counted. I'm Brother L.D. Azober, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Count Time Podcast. We have something very, very special for you. We're going to jumpstart Black History Month. We're going to be doing something that's a little different than what most of us are used to. We have here today Dr. Haywood Hall, the son of the great, the legendary, the one and only Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. Welcome to Count Time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, first of all, let me say we was honored and thrilled to be at the event last night at UNO, at the University of New Orleans, where they gave honor, paid homage to your mother. Thanks to Kathy Hambrick at the River Road African American Museum, thanks to the UNO Hurricane Lawn Library and the Midlo Center for hosting the event. We appreciate you all. We enjoyed it. It was a great event, a great opportunity for many to gather and share the greatness of your mother and how they impacted her. How did you feel about that?
Oh, I thought it was amazing. Like I said, I actually have very deep roots in New Orleans, but I wasn't as connected to them, because I was raised by somebody from New Orleans outside, and spent a lot of time in other areas of the United States and also in Mexico. And so I came back to New Orleans very rarely, really. This was sort of a coming home thing for my heart, I think. And it's amazing the connections and the things that I think that she's done that are now her legacy, and the way that she's inspired all of these different people, of course, she inspired me. She was also my mom, right? So, the relationship's a little different, right? I mean, but when you see that she's kind of everybody else's mom too, in a way.
Oh, okay.
That was pretty significant for me, to see all of these great people who've done great things and who said, Gwendolyn was there, Dr. Gwendolyn Hall was there at a key moment, and she mentored me, and she did all that. Well, she did that for me too, but not in the area of history, because that's not what I chose to do. I was my own, rebellious self, and when I reached a certain point, it was like I got to do something, and I can't do what my parents do, So my dad was a pretty big political figure, and
wasn't thinking about that.
Oh yeah, it's a whole nother thing,
and so they had to lead the country.
Yeah, so I had this very narrow little bandwidth to try to figure out what I was going to do. And I can tell you, I tried to fail.
You tried to fail.
I tried to fail. I dropped out of high school. I dropped out of high school. I was a piano tuner. I was a musician. I drove a cab in New York. I did all kinds of other stuff. I tell people I went to medical school because I failed at everything else. But
so you was in the wilderness for quite some time.
Yeah. I had to find my way. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And Mom was very much. She had her way of not telling me what to do, but just explaining in a subtle way what happens when you don't do certain things. And it's like, well, I remember her saying, not everybody has to go to college. You could just get a job and and just work and stuff, and then and then you have to pay rent, and then stuff like that. And I go, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to work and pay rent. Wait a minute, the rent part. Okay, well, I want to work, I want to make some money, and then, and then she knew that I'd come around eventually and start. And so she kind of.
She was hoping you come around.
Yeah,
eventually.
well, that just was her way of not enforcing anything. She just make me find my own way, but supporting the decisions. So she was a master at that. Negative psychology.
Now, you give us a brief also rundown of where you was born, where you lived at before you end up where you are now.
Okay, there's nothing brief about that.
We do the best we can. We're gonna do the best.
Yeah, I was born in Brooklyn in 1956.
Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah, my parents had just returned from their exile in Europe somehow.
They was in exile.
Well, yeah, kind of.
What part of Europe were they in?
Well, they're in France, and I have a brother that was born in France, and he's a half brother, and my these stories are just go on. People say, well, tell me about your story, and I go, well, it started in 1898, as far as I know, But so my parents met in France in 1950, and they were there. That was a pretty big exile community for black intellectuals. I mean, this was the 50s, so anybody.
So now a European Jewish woman meets a African, but he was American African, right?
Well, he was part Native American too.
Oh, your dad was part of it?
Okay. Yeah.
What tribe? You know what tribe?
Yeah, he was Shawnee. You see, that's why the story, I mean, if you start from where I was born, you don't get any of the backstory, and then it just doesn't fit very well. My mother wasn't, my mother was obviously born here in New Orleans, and she was very much a rebel, and I mean, she was at the, when W.E.B. Du Bois gave the Behold the Land speech, she was on the stage in the background. She was 18 years old, and she was always involved.
She heard
She was right there. I mean, and she, this was unheard of for a white woman to be doing, these things. I mean, she was part of the Negro Youth League, and she was, she never accepted the status of quo of how blacks were treated or how they were devalued in any way, and so she became quite a firebrand, and enough to get her into enough trouble that they sent her off to Paris, thinking that they would get her out of their hair because she about to
get everybody killed.
Because I mean she was at an interracial party of Tulane, and that was illegal, and I think they all wound up in the front page of the Times-Picayune and whatever. This was a big embarrassment, so they sent my mom off to France to study piano. They thought that was going to fix the problem, and of course she comes back with this revolutionary black leader. It's like one of those guess who's coming to dinner things. Guess who's not coming to dinner.
So I guess your mom, her mom and dad think they were Lord. What? Yeah, got a whistle.
Yeah. So I was born into that, whole thing, and this was the McCarthy era and all this. My father was a pretty famous black communist, among other things.
Communist.
And he was, they were, he was much further along in age than my mom was, and so this was just a scandal, and so we wound up, forced out of the country. This is what happened with my family many times. Is that the FBI were on blacklists. They couldn't get jobs. They couldn't.
That was what you call a real blacklist.
Yeah, that was literally blacklist. Yeah, that's how it started. That's the blacklist. They named it after my dad. No, I don't think that's quite right, but you get the idea. Okay. But so we had to move to Mexico, and
so you was born in Brooklyn,
New York.
Yeah,
and I stayed there for about a year, and then I moved. My parents went to Mexico.
Y'all went from Mexico when you was a child.
Yeah.
So you never really spent much time in the U.S.
No, I grew up in Mexico. I lived in Mexico till I was 8.
What part of Mexico?
Spanish first. Again, I lived a bunch of places.
Oh, okay. Y'all want to move again, huh? Even in Mexico, you had to be able to move, right?
Yeah, we had the Secret Service show up at our door in Mexico City, because John F. Kennedy was coming in 1963, and I guess they just needed us to leave town or something crazy, I mean, the stories are intense. So I went to 12 different schools by the time I was in 10th grade. Then I dropped out. So,
I can see why you dropped out.
Yeah, I mean, I get tired of adjusting, But I lived in Mexico City and Guadalajara, and in Cuautla, and in Cuernavaca. Those are four very distinct places.
Now, you presently live in?
I live in Guanajuato now.
Guanajuato?
Central Mexico. Yeah. So I mean, it's a long story.
We got time.
Right, okay, good. My father, basically, like I said, he was a radical. He was born in 1898. His parents were born slaves.
Your dad was born in 1898?
Yes, 1898.
Well, hold on, how old are you?
Yeah, I knew you were going to bring that up.
You look too young. Let this happen up. So
okay,
you might be adopted.
Yeah, no, I'm one of the undead. I'm one of those people. Yeah. So he was born in 1898.
No, when were you born?
I was born in 1956. So my mother was in her 20s and my father was almost in his 60s. Okay. And his parents were born slaves.
Where?
They were in Tennessee. There's a county in Tennessee called Haywood County. There's a person of note that comes from there. Tina Turner comes from the same place. So there's a plantation there. So I assume that's had something to do with it. So anyway, so my father fought in World War I in an all-black battalion. You've heard of the Hellfighters, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so there were actually 2 black battalions. Another one was the Illinois regiment, and he was in that one. And he fought in this all-black battalion, but the U.S. Army would not refuse to command them. They refused to command them, so they turned them over to the French. So he fought under French command, but he was still a U.S. Army corporal, I think. And ultimately he wound up being buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which is another crazy.
Who, your dad?
Yeah, crazy thing.
So they brought it from Mexico to bury him?
No. I jumped ahead.
Oh,
let me just go back because we're still at 1918. Okay.
Okay. Let's go.
So he comes back from the war, and there were all these riots, and there was all kinds of intense stuff going on at that time, and there was a lot of terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan, and there were all these black military trained people coming back after fighting in Europe, and he was like, we don't have to put up with this. So he joined an organization called the African Black Brotherhood. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is 1920s. This is the pre-Black Panther Party. There were about 5,000 military trained blacks who said simply, we're going to shoot back. And of course,
in Illinois, Chicago.
This was all over the United States.
Okay.
I mean,
because they had trained. The military had already trained these people.
Well, they were trained in the military, and they were just they came back fighting. They said, that was when the Communist Party was born too. And the Russian Revolution and all of that, and so, they were inspired somewhat by that and all that idealism. And so they had kind of singled my father out as one of their leaders, and he wound up in Russia and went to school at the Lenin School for the Lenin School for the Toilers of the East, and all this stuff. It was a revolutionary training ground. Crazy, right?
Okay.
So he went to school with Ho Chi Minh and with Deng Xiaoping and with Kenyatta, all these people. I can show you this stuff in Wikipedia. It's crazy, but it's all there. And then he came back, and he was on the he was very high up in the Communist Party at the time when the Depression was hitting, and the Communist Party was actually a pretty big force. And a lot of what the reforms from FDR came from kind of a counter thing, like that they had to kind of clean up their act and start thinking about society and other stuff. So it was kind of interesting. But anyway, he went on and he became a command officer during the Spanish Civil War. That's the one with Hemingway. I mean, people know it from that. But so he was a command officer from there.
And Your father was?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, probably one of the first black commanders over white troops, maybe in history. I mean, I don't know other situations where that had occurred. And then he fought in World War I as a merchant marine. He was a merchant marine back then, and then he came back to the States, and he in the 20s he developed a whole position paper on black self-defense movement in the 20s, and I mean, like Nelson Mandela and all those folks were in the Communist Party, and a lot of them were inspired by his work. So most people know my dad for all of that. And so then my mom shows up, and that she's in the middle of that. So anyway, by the 1950s, I mean, we were on J. Edgar Hoover's short list. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover had, the head of the FBI, had this whole concept of making sure that the civil rights movement didn't connect internationally with and they kind of went out of their way. I'd have to say that's what probably did Malcolm X in,
You had to get rid of him.
Yeah.
'Cause he started traveling.
Yeah, so they didn't want that. And by then the Communist Party had backed out of all of their civil rights work in the 50s for other weird reasons. And so he'd been exiled, he'd been expelled from the Communist Party. So he was completely isolated and wound up back he wound up in Mexico where all these Spanish Civil War veterans were,
So he couldn't come back to his home
I mean, he could come
And
back, but
live comfortably.
No, we would get evicted. They couldn't keep jobs. My mom couldn't keep jobs. Nobody could work. So we wound up back in Mexico. And so I grew up in Mexico in a completely different environment, so it's a very long story, as you can see. So I was there till I was 8, and then my mom, while in Mexico, she spent a lot of, I'd say the first 10 years of their relationship, maybe more, helping my dad with a lot of his stuff, and helping him write and edit and all of those things.
So
and
your
then,
dad wrote several books too?
Oh, yeah.
You know some name? You know the name of it?
Well, there's one was called Black Bolshevik. Another one is called Negro Liberation. That was 1947, 48.
And by who?
By Harry Haywood.
Harry Haywood.
Yeah, that was his pen name, not his real name. Where were we? I'm sorry.
You're talking about when he moved back, your mom had to help.
Yeah, so then my mother, began studying, got interested in history, and started developing her own career. And then, and then at some point, she decided to come back to the U.S. with her kids, with myself and my sister. And that was 1964.
Now what's your sister name?
Rebecca. Yeah. And so we wound up back in New York City for a little while. I lived in the Lower East Side. I lived in the Upper West Side. And Lower East Side, I mean, I was a Spanish-speaking black kid, and there were Puerto Ricans there, but they weren't Mexicans, and it was a very different situation. And then I wound up in North Carolina. My mother got a job at Elizabeth City State College. And, it was actually illegal for black people and white people to live under the same roof then. And this was my mom, and they,
Get rid of my children?
Yeah. And so she was there, and, they thought she was Creole, so therefore she, she could have black kids or something. And then they found out who my dad was, of course, and they wound up chasing her out, and we wound up living in Detroit. And we were like in inner city Detroit right before all those riots.
You had to go to the hood now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, I mean, that was a pretty amazing time for me, because, I'm kind of getting acculturated to a completely different setting. I mean, first of all, I have to say the soundtrack was amazing. I mean, Motown, the music was just amazing, But in the meantime, I'm living in the middle of all of this, and there's the Detroit Tactical Police, and there's all this tension and all this stuff. And
what's going on in Motown?
Yeah, literally, it was pretty intense, and we barely got out. I mean, the whole place blew up. I mean, 43 people were killed in my neighborhood when the riots came. And but we just basically slipped out. She got into the University of Michigan, and that's where she got her PhD, and everything kind of settled down for us in a lot of ways. There's a whole bunch of stories related to this, and this could go on. But so I was there in Ann Arbor, Michigan during the late 60s, and that was very, I mean, this was an academic city and, upper middle class white town.
Okay, but just did when you came back at 8 years of age,
yeah,
you speak in Spanish.
Yeah.
Now you moving around the different parts of the country. You lived in 3 different places already.
Yeah.
All right. But you still speaking Spanish and learning English now?
Yeah, but by the time I got to, soon after leaving New York, I was not hearing Spanish anymore, and I was under a lot of pressure to learn English too, right? So somehow I put Spanish in the background, and so I had to, just, get better in English, and that's what I did. I mean, I went for many years without speaking Spanish, but it was always there,
Okay.
you know. In Ann Arbor was a whole thing with the whole radical underground and the SDS and all that stuff. There was always this radicalism in my family, and so I was always in seeing all of these things. And then my mom got a job at Rutgers, you know, and that's where we went, where things got really stable. But in Ann Arbor, I was playing music. I was a drummer, and you know,
How old were you at the time?
I was like 15.
You started playing music?
Yeah, yeah. We had a band, and we had our house. I mean, I was like 15 years old. We had a band house just to get ourselves into as much trouble as possible, which we did. So then I moved to New Jersey, which I didn't want to do. I mean, that was not much after being in Ann Arbor, but. And I wound up dropping out of high school in New Jersey, and that's, you know, and I was still a musician, and I decided I was going to go to New York to be like a musician. That's what you're supposed to do. So I went there, and, you know, it was kind of crazy. I ran into all these amazing musicians. They were all starving to death.
You rethought your career?
Yeah. Well, it took me a
musician.
while. You know, I tell people, you know, I realized that I could be a really great musician and starve to death, or be a really bad doctor and do really well. You know, but that's not what I did. But that's just to give you an idea of how that whole thing was. It's like it didn't matter how good you were. You know, it's crazy. You know, that's so. But. And plus, I make fun of this because I was a drummer. I mean, that was the time when disco was on the horizon, and I said, "Oh no, I'm not gonna be a disco drummer for my life. That's not gonna work." So anyway, so that's how that happened. And then so I went to Brooklyn College after getting my GED at the my GED from the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken in one weekend. I said this was much better than high school.
But look, Doc, I don't know. We can let the people in Mexico hear about you.
So yeah, so I got into the City University of New York in an open admissions program, and I had to spend a year, you know, doing algebra and all these things that, you know.
That you had bypassed.
Yeah. There's a whole nother story that was really funny that
Let me hear
I
it.
need to share it, because, so, you know, I went from musician. I was tuning pianos as a backup.
How old are you now? How old are you?
Back then, yeah, I was like 18, 19, you know. And then, you know, I had this piano tuner rebuilder who was my mentor, and I was working with him. And he was this guy who survived a concentration camp, and he was like this master mechanic, piano mechanic. And so I was his student for a while. And then he said, you know, Haywood, you know, you've gotten to the point where you need to go work at Steinway, you know, which is, you know, so, right. So I said, okay. So I went out to Queens where the Steinway factory was, and I got out, and, you know, and it was it was not a very friendly neighborhood to me. You know, I ran into a bunch of thugs there. I think that's the right word. And they said, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to go work at Steinway. And they said, no, you're not. You're not going to be in this neighborhood. I went, you know, you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought of that before. Before this, it didn't occur to me. And it's like, so, okay, they went my career with that. So, and then...
That didn't last long?
Yeah, that didn't last long. So, one of my dad's friends got me a job at Con Edison reading electric meters. So I was reading electric meters for Con Ed, and that was a great job. I mean, it paid well, and I got to get around town and all of that and learn a lot about people. And New York's a great place to read meters because you're in all these cultures, you know. It's great. I really loved it. But it was wearing down on me at this point. And I know this is an endless story. It has nothing, I'm not sure.
Okay, you do great.
But one day I read meters in a hospital, and I was like pretty much fed up with the job. And I looked around and I said, wow, you know, I hadn't thought of this. And this is something my parents don't do. So this is something I could probably do, you know. So I decided I was going to do that.
So you went to the hospital to read a meter.
Yeah.
And decided you want to go be a doctor.
Yeah, it just like a bolt of lightning. It just came out of nowhere. And
I guess you're working with electric meters, so it was. You got electric. I got electric.
Yeah, I got electric shock. Yeah, the meters were right outside this emergency department, so I just got like this thing stuck in my head that I could do this. And then there was a guy that I worked with who was always carrying organic chemistry books and stuff. And I went and talked to him. He was a guy from Trinidad, Philippe. And I said, so I see you're carrying all these books and stuff, and you know, I'm just curious about what you're doing. He goes, well, I'm planning to go to medical school. I've got interviews at Harvard and Yale, and, you know, I got a 4.0 index, and this guy was like a party animal. And I thought, wow, you know, if he can do this, maybe I can do it. And he said, you know, you can do this because, you know, you're a pretty smart guy. You just have to put your mind to it. And I went, oh, okay. So I got in. That's where I decided to get my GED, and I volunteered at the hospital. I got into Brooklyn College, open admissions. I come back to visit the guys I work with a year later, and he's still there. And I go, so wait, what happened? I mean, Harvard and Yale. And he said, well, I'm looking at some schools in the Midwest. I went, okay. So he didn't get in. He's just applying. That's not abnormal. So then, you know, I go back to school, and I'm doing pretty well. I go back to visit the next year, and he's still there. I go, so now what happened? He goes, well, I'm looking at some schools in Europe. And I go, wow, the guy didn't get in. Well, you know, so then the guys that I worked with took me aside and said, Haywood, you know, you'd never realize this, but Philippe doesn't really go to school. He just makes all this stuff up. And I said, but my mentor is a pathological liar.
But he's a great mentor.
Yeah, he's a great mentor. So I go off and live this guy's fantasy, basically, as far as I could tell. It was crazy. And one of my sayings has always been, just because somebody's a pathological liar doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to them. And that's worked very well for me. Yeah. I mean, he obviously meant very well. And he put on quite a show. And, and he helped me a lot. What can I say? So, yeah.
Got you on the right track. Your mom probably happy.
Yeah.
She would love to have seen Philippe.
Right. So then I went to Houston for medical school, and I had this idea.
Now where'd you graduate?
I went from Brooklyn College, City University of New York, to Houston, to Baylor College of Medicine.
Baylor.
And I, at this point, I kind of was looking at maps, and I was feeling a little uncomfortable about some things in the North. You know, I mean, people think there's no racism in the North, and of course that's not the case. Like I told you, Mike Steinway drama, and I'd been stopped by the police and had all this problems and stuff, but I won't go into those things. So I was just kind of fed up with the North, and I thought I need to be looking elsewhere and seeing what's going on.
That's interesting. Most people leave the South to go to the North.
I know.
So there was never any peace.
So up there it was like, there's a lot of racism here, but nobody wants to call it that. And, you just get backstabbed, and I was thinking, if I'm going to have to deal with racism, I want it to be in my face. So then I moved to Texas, and then after 2 weeks of that, I was like, I don't think I want it to be in my face anymore. I think these two people need to get back into the closet where they belong. Let's pretend to be civilized.
So now you want to go back to the North now.
But Texas, this was a very good medical school. It was close to Mexico, so I kind of liked that idea, and it was close to the Caribbean. My spouse then was from Jamaica, and I thought, well, this is perfect. And I also went to some interviews. I went to Ann Arbor, where I thought I was going to go to University of Michigan, where I was with my mom, and I got there, and it was like 20 below zero and a whole bunch of snow and
after living in Louisiana.
Yeah, I was
Texas,
like, no way I'm going to be doing this, And then I went to Texas for the interview, and it was 70 degrees, and the sky was blue, and the birds were chirping, and I went, this is great, And of course, they forgot that I didn't really hear about the summers till that was all. I didn't really get that part together until later. But so I did that at Houston. I had a good medical education. Culturally, it was horrible. I mean, back then I was this black, Spanish-speaking, vegetarian, there were 3 blacks out of 168 students. And they were mostly, they were just very, kind of Baptist and culturally was just not quite a good fit for me. So, but during that time I did go to Mexico a little bit and started to get to feel I hadn't been there in a long time, and suddenly I'd cross into Mexico and I could start breathing again. I was thinking, what's going on? This is kind of different. It's like I can relax. I didn't realize how defensive I was in the United States. I mean, I can see in retrospect that I had to put on a certain amount of armor to function, and that for being black, and that for being Spanish speaking, and that for all these different reasons. I had to have a pretty good amount of armor, and then I'd be in Mexico and like I could breathe, like wow, this feels good, So I finished my training in the United States. I did the rest of my training in New Mexico, which was as close to Mexico as you could get, and did all my training there and got involved in public health stuff and different things. And emergency medicine was my main career, and then I started getting a really close view of the healthcare system, because there's no better close-up view than the emergency department, and it's pretty rough. People go into healthcare, I like to think, because of altruistic reasons. They want to, do things that are good for people, and that's kind of the fairy tale version of what we do. And then you get there, and it's like there's this whole medical industrial complex, and there's all this legal stuff and all this administrative stuff and all this corporate stuff, and it's just dehumanizing. It's
the people, the patients are the last thing.
Yeah, and my job in emergency medicine is to kind of figure out who needs to be admitted, and everybody. I mean, the one reason I was attracted to emergency medicine is because you almost by definition have to see everybody. You don't exclude anybody from the care, but that means that you have to be an advocate for people in situations where they can't otherwise get care, and it's just gotten progressively harder and more difficult to do that in the system. It's a system where, we spend it's over $10,000 per man, woman, and child per capita, really, and it's 20% of the gross national product of the United States, and we don't provide decent health care. We have the same life expectancy that they have in Cuba, where they spend a small percentage of what we spend. So there's a difference between clinical medicine, and healthcare. Healthcare is the system. The system is shot in the United States. I just went off on a big tangent there, didn't I?
So the system is broke?
Very broke.
Okay.
Very broke.
Most of us know that.
Yeah, and
but they're gonna break you if you ever go to the hospital.
Yeah, eventually. I mean, you like I said, it's, you're spending $10,000 a year, even when you're not using it. You go on for decades like that, and then something happens, and then boom, you're like $1 million down, literally, because you had cancer, or you got hit by a car, or you had a heart attack. I mean, we're talking about amazingly high bills, and it's ridiculous. Anyway, that's off.
Now, so also in Mexico, you have also created your own pathway into helping those in the community. What are you doing to offset some of this? Yeah, so I wound up in Mexico. I was pretty disillusioned with the healthcare system, and I really was overwhelmed by the way that it worked and didn't work. And like I said, I found myself more comfortable in Mexico, and I went down and started getting involved. I mean, I realized that I had skills and things that I could teach people, that was a setting where I could do that. So I started training people in emergency care and developed these certification programs, and we've trained about 40,000 people. 40,000?
Yeah. Doctors and nurses and even midwives, and we've trained them in emergency obstetrics, how to deliver babies in emergencies, and also cardiac care and trauma and all of this stuff.
Because Mexico is not like America; they don't have hospitals on every corner.
Mexico's pretty. I mean, it's got a reasonably sophisticated medical system. I mean, and I feel that they try a lot, and they've made a lot of progress in the time that I've been there. And I do have to say, and this is nothing. People always talk about America versus Mexico. Mexico's in America too.
Right.
All this, but it's mostly a socialized system, like almost like literally everywhere else. I mean, there's a certain amount of of socialized medicine in Mexico, and so they address the needs of the whole population to some extent or another, and I think that they've improved a lot. But they had trouble, getting the skills and maintaining the skills needed, and so that's one thing that I've been able to do with them is to provide the training and competency-based certification, which is something that they really needed, and we've worked mostly with the Mexican government doing this, so we've been helping them a lot.
So well, that's different. Your mom and dad worked against the government, but you working with the government.
Not against the Mexican government.
Not against the Mexican government. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then when I started doing my projects, I had some medical students and stuff from the U.S. contact me and say they wanted to come help me with the projects, and they wanted to learn Spanish. And I went, oh, I could do a medical Spanish school. So I started this medical Spanish program, and we've trained about 700 people in that. These are U.S. They're U.S. Doctors who are in training or in residency or who are already in practice, and they come down and learn how to communicate with Spanish-speaking people. There's 50 million Spanish-speaking people in the United States. 35 million are Mexican-American. So these are large numbers. It used to be just like there are certain places where they speak Spanish, but now pretty much every major city.
Everywhere you go now.
Yeah.
At one time, New Orleans didn't have.
Right. With Hurricane Katrina, there was a huge influx, and that's when we started getting calls from Louisiana saying, "Can you train some of our people in Spanish?" So.
Oh,
okay.
That's how that.
Yeah. Well, the healthcare system, the doctors and stuff needed to be able to communicate with the patients. So that's kind of what I've been doing, and that's very much an anthropological thing too.
Yeah, but you don't come to the U.S. that often, though.
This is a whole nother weird story. Is that I have a very portable skill. Emergency medicine, I don't need an office or staff or any of those things. I just can parachute in and start working.
Parachute in.
Yeah. So. Yeah, well, it's concierge sounds like it's very high.
That's too high.
But when I did my plan, I looked at a map and I said, where can I work in the United States, the closest possible place to where I'm going to live? And I looked on a map and I said, oh, there's this place, Brownsville, Texas, and Harlingen, Texas, and it's like, okay,
it's on Mexico border.
It's right on the border. So, I figured out how I can get to the border and cross the bridge. I'm a migrant worker. I tell people this. I'm literally a migrant worker. I cross the bridge and I work 3 or 4 shifts a month, 3 or 4 shifts in a row, twice a month. So I come back and forth. So I'm a migrant worker. I live in central Mexico. I fly up to Monterrey, Mexico. I leave my car there. I get in my car and then I drive across the border, and I do that twice a month. And I go back and forth. It's kind of crazy. It's a different thing. And I've been doing that for, 15 or 20 years, and it's worked really well, except then this COVID thing came along, and suddenly it was a big problem. So,
So, but no, you never been detained, and nobody ever.
It's funny because I have all the papers I need to be in either country. So they actually couldn't stop me from coming or going in either direction. I was afraid I was going to be quarantined on both sides at the same time.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
All right, then.
So anyway, so that's kind of what got me up to this point. Was that enough of a background, or
no,
there's more, right?
I mean, that's not even a touch of what your history is.
Yeah.
But we do want to talk about my first time meeting you was just last night at your mother's celebration of your mother, and I enjoyed the dialogue we had just in that brief minute. Hold on, this brother talk about something I ain't never thought about, right? And I brought you to talk to some other people, cause this is something we're not familiar with in the U.S., right? And I want you to give a little brief history of. First of all, we're gonna title it's Black History Month in the U.S.
Yeah.
And we're gonna title this Black History in Afro-Mexico.
Yeah.
That's how they go?
Yeah.
Afro-Mexico Black History.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're going to be our historian, our renowned speaker today, speaking on this subject matter, because it's a lot more insight than most of us never thought about.
Yeah.
African Mexico history, Black history, right?
Yeah.
So we want you to kind of just start by, the history of of Mexico, the leadership of Mexico, and the people in there. How many of us are there now?
Yeah. Well, so Mexico has a large population of Afro-Mexicans. There's 2.5 million Afro-Mexicans. The total population is about 130 million in Mexico. And they've just finally, after quite a while, been recognized as in the census as a minority group, but it all of the Americas has this history related to slavery, and Mexico is no exception. There were large groups of blacks in Mexico, and people don't really understand or recognize that. We in the U.S. we kind of have a stereotypic idea of what a Mexican is, and when you travel, you really start to see that it's not like that at all. There's really quite a bit of diversity. So there's areas of Mexico that have large black populations. This is like Guerrero and Oaxaca and Veracruz traditionally. Veracruz is kind of like the New Orleans of Mexico in many ways. And people don't realize what a pivotal role Afro-Mexicans have had in the development of Mexican society. One of the original revolutionaries, founding fathers, was Jose Maria Morelos, and he was an Afro-Mexican, and he was one of the 4 instigators of the Mexican Revolution. And I always say, well, he got to the revolution 10 years too early, so they all got executed. But you shouldn't get to the revolution too early. But I mean, he's recognized as one of the founding fathers. And the second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, was Afro-Mexican, and he outlawed slavery. And there are a lot of people in Oaxaca, this area, the Costa Chica of Oaxaca, and also in Guerrero, who are, have been connected to their African roots, and they're often mixed with indigenous people from Mexico. They're kind of Creoles, and those are Afro-mestizos. That's how they're
mestizos.
Mestizos are mixtures of well, classically a mestizo is Spaniard and Native American. And then when I mean Native American, you have to understand Mexico is Native Americans. I mean, that's what it is. So now if you mix the Spaniards, the folks with Aztec and Mayan blood, and the and Africans, then you get Afro-mestizos. And places in Belize, for instance, are very interesting because they have a group called the Garifuna, which are Africans mixed with Mayans, Yeah, so, there's these very interesting mixtures of people. And, you don't realize this until you start traveling, but that entire Atlantic coast, all the way down to Panama, is African. So, we know Belize has a lot of Africans' blood, right? And Belize and Guatemala are side by side. They were actually together at some point. But if you go a country down, that's Honduras. And all along that coast there's a lot of African blood there. And the same with Nicaraguans along the Atlantic coast and all the way down Costa Rica. That side, it was always African, West Indian, very much West Indian. And by the time you get to Panama's so skinny that it's kind of all got mixed up. But still, it's more Africanized on the Atlantic coast. And then, you have to ask how it is that these Africans got to places like Oaxaca and Guerrero, which is on the Pacific side. It's like, wow, that's a big distance. You can see Veracruz being connected to the rest of the Caribbean, but it's hard to see how this happened there. But I think that there was a migration across Panama and then back up, because if you go on the Pacific side in South America, and I'm talking about Colombia and Peru, again, there's a whole bunch of Africans. So it's very interesting. It's part of a discovery that I'm involved in there, trying to just I have to travel and try to see more of what's there. I went to a place near Ixtapa, which is a resort. Nearby is a town called Zihuatanejo, which is where the Mexicans go, and people were very friendly and open to me, and they took me to see an art gallery, and it had all these African things there, and they were talking about the third root, and the third root was the Africans. And I realized that they were doing all kinds of things there, trying to connect to their African background.
What this place is? Name of this place again?
Well, Zihuatanejo is still sort of a resort town in the town of Guerrero, in the state of Guerrero. And remember, Guerrero was the vice president, black vice president. If you go further south from there, these are people who were much more African, and when I'm there, people said, "Oh, we thought that you were from El Rancho. We thought you were from out in the country because we have all these folks that look like you there, and so I was like, wow, this is really great, So
being in that part of the Mexico, the part of the world, is like being here in New Orleans. You see a lot.
Well, I mean, New Orleans is very unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it's clearly, I mean, I think that there is some very interesting mixtures of people there, and there's a lot of strong African influence that there's a lot of connections that still need to be made. I just been thinking about this, having, if there was a connection between New Orleans and this area, it would be like a huge hit. I mean, if, to be able to do some interaction, some stuff there
what you call that again? Assistant city.
Yeah, some kind of thing like that would be a massive thing there. It would just draw a ton of attention, and I think people would really be into it. So I just started thinking about this in the last day. It would be a wonderful thing to connect.
Being here in New Orleans and thinking about the energy you see and feel here to what the experience you had there.
Yeah, I think it would be amazing.
And I mean, in New Orleans, they just call them Creoles here. Y'all call them mestizos, right?
Afro-mestizos.
But the same situation. Same.
But these are mostly kind of rural areas. They're not like, I mean, that's, you can't say it's like New Orleans. New Orleans is a big city.
Metropolitan.
Yeah. You have to talk about the cities, right? I mean, there's probably more Afro-Mexicans and Afro-Mestizos in the cities than there are in these places. I mean, but Mexico City's got 21 million people in it, so everybody's just a drop in the bucket there. But percentage-wise, it's going to be very small. But in terms of actual numbers, there's going to be more Afro-Mexicans in Mexico City, for instance. So it is interesting that if you look up Afro-Mexicans on Wikipedia and Afro-Mestizos, you get to see a lot of what I'm talking about, and it's very interesting and very beautiful people, and check out the videos there, and you'll see some of the history, and it's pretty amazing.
Now, how long have you been there now?
In Mexico?
Yes.
Well, I guess I bought a house in Mexico in '96, so it's been 25 years that I've been there.
You figure I just come across the border and go back?
Yeah, I'm a migrant worker, yeah. I'm in Mexico, I'm not a doctor, actually. I don't have a license in Mexico. And I didn't pursue one either. I didn't want to be competing with local doctors over patients. I wanted to train people, so that I didn't want to be in a conflict situation about that. So and that helped a lot, I think. Most people travel internationally and they think they want to be doctors internationally and all this some kind of missionary stuff, and that's not what this was at all. But
your plan over the years that, because you say once you decided I didn't want to live in the U.S.
Yeah.
And where I'm gonna go from here?
Yeah, so I could work in the U.S. I cross the border, get some work done, and then go back. And I come back for conferences. Actually, for the first 10, 15 years, everybody just thought I was crazy, but kind of like my mom, I guess. and then they started catching on that I was doing something that was significant in Mexico, and then I wound up, going to conferences and showing our work. So it's been a long road. it's been very different. I mean, not many. It's I went to a meeting last year where sponsored by the American College of Emergency Physicians, and there's a subspecialty of emergency medicine called international. What's global emergency medicine or international emergency medicine, and there are now 40 training programs in international emergency medicine, and I started doing this before there were any of those training programs, and so I got kind of dragged out there as one of the founders of this subspecialty. So there are all these people training in international, but I just kind of went out and did it.
You have any children?
Do I have children?
Yes.
Yeah, I just have a daughter we just had our grandson, my first grandson, last month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was, we train people in emergency obstetrics and all the things that can go wrong, and we had a serious lesson in all these things.
With your own daughter?
Yeah, it was. But everybody pulled through, and but it was terrifying. Especially when you train people in this, it's like, how could all of these things happen to my grandson? But he wound up getting airlifted out, and he wound up on a ventilator, wound up all this stuff, and I was like, I was just a mess. I'm still recovering from the shock. In New Mexico, Taos, New Mexico. And I wouldn't have chosen that place, but there's not enough resources there when things go bad. And yeah. You don't want to get really sick there. And I worked in that hospital, and it's a great community, but like you said, you can't get sick in a place like that because they can't even fly you out sometimes because it gets so snowed in, and so that was a quite experience. Then I have two stepsons, and they're 18 and 19, and one's going to medical school in Mexico, and and the other's going to be a chef. So I'll be eating well, I hope, in my old age.
And none of it was quite rambunctious like the dad did, huh?
I don't know. It's early. When I was their age, I was, just starting my meter reading career. So, I don't, tell them to do anything.
So Guanajuato?
Guanajuato is the city and state where I live.
And that's gonna be home for you.
That's been home for me. Then that's where my mom's been with me for. And
that's where y'all buried at?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. My wife's from Guanajuato, and the house that we're at, my mother bought in 2003, and she spent her last years there, and we were able to take really good care of her there. I learned a lot about taking care of people at home, and there's a whole revolution in healthcare that's like digital health and telemedicine and all those things. I got involved in those things, and I'm doing more of that work now that there's all these changes happening, and that's kind of a natural
you
thing.
Fall right into what you was doing.
Again,
you might not have to go across the border as much anymore.
Right. It's like this, I have to all these distances, and I've been training people so that people can be closer to medical people who are competent and trained, and now there's all this technology showing up, and it's like, okay, let's do it that way. So the last 7 years I've been doing digital health, and I've been running telemedicine programs in the U.S. And now I'm starting one in Mexico. So
now your mom, all her great works, all that she contributed to this world in the area of the history, the information. She went and read she went to different countries to read, break down documents from France to Wales,
Spain, Cuba,
and put this database.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Of information. One woman gathered all this information of her life study have been of the African diaspora. So what are you gonna do?
Those are some. My parents are some big shoes to fill, and so I can't. I don't think I can compete in that realm per se.
But all this resources of information, knowledge that the world is looking for, want to have access to.
Well, I mean, I think I have. I have in my DNA a lot of things from my mom and my dad that gives me a global perspective, and they are change agents. These are people who see things in the world that they recognize as problems and barriers, and they figure out how to overcome them and how to make things work differently. And so I've inherited that part. I'm sort of a social entrepreneur. I find problems and then I try to build systems to build businesses or other organizations to fix them. And so, and it's my stuff is obviously very, we're talking about medicine and things like maternal mortality rates and things that are like that. So it's very much I don't want to say more scientific, but because what my mother did really was bring all of this data into a field where there wasn't data. History was mostly kind of narratives and people's perspectives, and how subjective that can get.
How subjective it is.
Yeah, and so she was, and it's really worth noting that she did all of this in her retirement, for the most part.
She passed that. How old was she?
Yeah, she started, once she retired from her regular job at Rutgers, where she, she did the things that professors need to do there and whatnot, but this was not her life calling per se. This was her job, and nobody would give her any leeway to do the things that she really wanted to do as a woman, as a middle-aged woman with black kids, in this kind of academic environment it was very hostile towards women, and this was just her job. And when she finished her job, she came to New Orleans, and then she started doing her passion. And it's remarkable because she started putting this database together when people were not even thinking about that. She's like this gray-haired old lady going around from one parish courthouse to the next, uncovering documents that nobody even knew were there, or had any clue what they meant or what they were about. And she just did that for like 16 years. She's a long hauler. She just sits there and just picks away, and nobody really gets it, understands any of it until boom, it's like, wow, now there's this database. And then the other absolutely genius thing about it is that she connected it to genealogy, so that made it something that was real to people. It wasn't some academic something that was not, there's this tendency in academia, everybody knows that they can get pretty separated and divorced from the day-to-day life of people. Connecting history to genealogy makes it a real thing for people. That's one of the things I would love to see in the symposium is to make sure that it has the community, that whole community part of it, and I think that's a huge thing. So she had this, activism background, and then has the academic part, and then the genealogy part, which is really this part that connects people to this. So I think that's a pretty powerful thing that she did.
Oh. And even at the time of her demise, she was still working, which you probably thought she was going to complete this final book.
Yeah, she's always been a whirlwind, and she sits, would sit around and just type away and do stuff. She
just do stuff.
Like, what is she doing now? I was like, I don't know. So she was with me for a good length of time, 10 years, and then she was also with me in the past. But, and she was getting up there in age and having medical problems, and she would go off to a conference, and she'd just schedule herself for a conference and fly off somewhere, and I'm like, where are you going now? It's like, well, you need to have some people with you, because she was fiercely independent, so she'd just make these arrangements for these complex things, and she'd go and then a good chunk of time she'd get ill, and then there'd be some problem, and it'd be hard for her to travel, and hard to get back. And I said, Mom, you got to slow down on this, because you got to find ways of reaching people through Zoom and other stuff, because this traveling is rough. So one time she went to conference, and she came back, and she got really sick, and she was septic, and really barely made it through, and I turned the home into the parts that weren't in the hospital. I kind of created a hospital at home, and I got nurses and got all these people to help run all of this, and I really shouldn't have been her doctor per se, but I did a fair amount of that. And she got through it, and then and then she wrote a book.
but she finished. She's just recovering from.
Yeah.
From
And
all
then another time she goes to another conference and comes back, and boom, she has to have a pacemaker, and she recovers from that and writes another book.
So what you gonna say?
Yeah,
you gotta let it go.
And then she's been, she was working on another book, and she got like all the way through to. Well, she has had a couple chapters to finish, and
but that's what she had told you. She had a couple chapters. Yeah. You know the title of that book was.
These things kind of go around in circles, so I don't think she actually had a title yet, and it's an unfinished work, and that's something that I have to look at, see how we can do it. Yeah. So it's an unfinished something that needs to be worked on.
But at 90, how old was she?
93.
93. She was still writing, organizing thoughts, everything, writing books.
Yeah.
And got people working for her, got people moving, getting this and getting that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess with technology, she still had access to the world, and so it wasn't as hard.
She was always very advanced in technology.
Oh, yeah, but she knew more about technology than the young people did.
Yeah.
Because she created her own database.
Right.
Now tell us a little bit about that. You familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it. People were not using, putting all this stuff, here it is. Ultimately, we got this, she got this CD, and this was all put on a platform at a biblio. But, this was a database that had some 50 fields in it per entry, and 50 potential fields, and it was like 105,000 slaves. It was all of the it was all the information from the 16 years of collecting data, and it connects people in all kinds of ways. People, it obviously has genealogy functions, but it was very interesting to me to see how she would use the database to find information. So, for instance, one of the things was, she could see what the average age was in New Orleans, and she could see these spikes that go up and down. And she goes, "You see where that where it spikes and it goes down?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "That's when a slave ship came in." So she could see the movements of people over, and she could really break it down, and she could see who the slaves were and where they came from, where the transshipment points were, and she knew, obviously who they were related to, if they were on the plantations. She knew what their skills were. She knew what their illnesses were. Just that granular level of knowing the population. And this was not like a sample. We in science, you think about samples and how they represent the larger picture. This was like literally, every slave during the French colonial period. There may be some other islands or areas where there's data, but this was not a sample per se. This was just like everyone, and doing that is like crazy, because that's like, this is the DNA of, African Americans in the Delta, and that's the DNA of the Africans that have migrated through the North, and they've transported all the culture that we know as Afro-American culture all throughout the United States. Now, there were other, obviously, Africans that were brought to the original 13 colonies, but, because of the British system, they were not that interested in the people that they were bringing. The French had, it sounds a little odd, but, it's kind of like wine to them. They were like really into understanding much more and a lot more details about the slaves for property reasons and for whatever. But I mean, there was just there was a lot more analysis of who the slaves were, and the point is that that Africans to this area came culture intact and maintained a lot of their culture, whereas in the 13 colonies, I think that a lot of the culture was just scrambled and they were left without their language and they're none, and it's hard to pull yourself up as a people when you have all of those things disrupted, but Louisiana didn't have that kind of disruption. I mean, there was disruption, but still, the Africans came over in many ways, culture intact, and continued to transmit that culture into this area, and then this brought it to the rest of the United States. And so, we're talking about, those who started blues and jazz and all of the, there's a taproot, there's a kind of if you look at maps over time, and that you do that, I'm sure it's like, like when we say Louisiana back then, we're talking about something that stretched all the way to Canada.
Oh, that's right. About that,
yeah. And so, over time, now there's all these different states, and like Tennessee says this, and but I mean, these are, to me, these are kind of iterations of something that's happening at a much deeper level, and that came from here. That came from New Orleans to me.
From the South, not just New Orleans, because most of the great musicians in Louisiana came out of small towns of Donaldsonville, A-Ben, what Joe King Oliver was from A-Ben, people like that.
But how does that knowledge of music diffuse through a population? I mean, you're talking about specific people who were, but they've been influenced by others, and they've heard other, so the fundamentals of what they do, the alphabet that they use, comes from somewhere, and to me that alphabet is here,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know that, where did the slaves come from in Mississippi? I mean, when they came, did they go directly to Mississippi? Or did they come?
I guess they had the ports.
They came through here, right?
The ports was. Most of them came down. Yeah,
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm talking about.
That's a good point. You're right.
So, it's sort of like a way of language. Language is diffused. I mean, so I think that alphabet is here. That's put together in different ways later on in time in different other places, and if you don't have a sense of history, you could say, well, this all started here in Tennessee, or it started somewhere else. But those people who started it were listening or part of something else, and those people were part of something else, and then you trace that back, and you wind up in New Orleans. That's what it looks like to me from a distance, and I'm not an expert on this.
No, but that's good, because we do fortunately have here Dr. George Jackson, who is one of the renowned scholars. He also is the chair of LSU Department of Anthropology and Geography.
Okay, yeah, we were talking about music, and the music in New Orleans is versus the music in some other areas, like Mississippi, Natchez, And I just wanted to make the point that a lot of the musicians in New Orleans that people think are from New Orleans are actually not from New Orleans. They were born in most of the parishes that are surrounding New Orleans, and they came into New Orleans as adults. Many of them had honed their craft before they came into New Orleans. Joe King Oliver, Ben, Louisiana, which is very near Donaldsonville. Kid Ory is from Reserve, Louisiana, which is right outside of New Orleans. And various others. I've done some research. I had 130 some musicians that were not born in New Orleans, but came into New Orleans after they became adults. I mean, some of them had already formed their bands. Some of them had been singing quartet music on the bridge outside of New Orleans in another parish. But then they come into New Orleans because that's the big city,
Right.
and that's where they think they really can make it.
Sure.
And many of them did. Like
Yeah.
look, Joe King Oliver, he
Yeah.
mentored Louis Armstrong,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
when they went north to Chicago. But
You know, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, and there's, you know, I think that I'm kind of looking at it a little bit like music as a language, you know, and you know, and language needs people, you know, and people concentrate in cities, you know, and so you know, it's not like it's not like this everything necessarily started here, but obviously it's a place where you get a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and concepts, and things start to come together in a different way. I mean,
right.
I've seen some of that in Brooklyn. You know, Brooklyn has all these different cultures, and people come there from the Caribbean and all these other places, and then it starts to meld into something that's something, yeah. And so there's some process like that. It seemed that maybe happened here to some extent.
And I always tell my students, I say, well, I hate to disappoint you, but language is not a universal thing, and music is not a universal language, as a lot of people think it is.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so, you know, you have to look at it, and then I started telling them you have to look at music like it's a language. So, you know, linguistics and ethnomusicology really go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's really interesting because neurologically, you know, there's speech centers in your brain, mostly on the left side, that allow you to speak and communicate in a language. And there's ways of lighting those areas up with some radiology so you can see that functioning, the language parts. The mirror image of that is where the music sits on the other side. It's literally the what would have been the language areas on the left side or on the right side, and that's the music areas. So it's very interesting. It's music and language is tied up very closely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And in some areas, that's a very thin line, you know, between speech and song.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
very thin. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I was trying to figure out the name of this African blues guitarist. I remember his name, Ali Farka Touré.
Oh,
You remember him? He was playing African blues, you know.
Yeah. Well, you know, that was what actually sort of captivated Ibrahim Seck, the historian.
Yeah.
When he came in this area, particularly in Mississippi, he
Yeah.
went to a juke joint and heard this bluesman playing. He said, "Wait a minute, that sounds like you know, Ngoni player in Senegal."
Yeah, right.
And it was almost, you know, just a couple of strings that he was playing with. And
the first time I heard that was on Ned Subalet's show, Afro Pop Worldwide.
Afro Pop.
And I used to, I mean, every week, I have to hear that show, you know, and it got me through so much stuff. And then to have him come into our lives interviewing my mom, and then, you know, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
I finally met him yesterday for the first time. It's
that was your first time.
Yeah.
He's been around. He practically lives in New Orleans.
Yeah. I thought he was. I mean, you know, He told me he was from Lubbock or something. I was like, what?
Yeah. But he kind of lives in New York, New Orleans, and Cuba, and Havana.
Yeah.
Santiago.
Yeah, Havana's a big music place too, huge.
And some of the music is very similar to
No, it's another big tap root for sure. Yeah, I like that.
Just really, I mean, I want to thank you, Brother Haywood, Dr. Haywood, for after meeting you last night and asking, look, can we do an interview? And you graciously accepted just to come here. But for you to take your time out your busy schedule to sit here this morning and do this interview means the world to me and my audience. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you very much. It means a lot to me to connect to this. You know, my wife yesterday said, you know, Haywood, you always said that you don't fit anywhere and you don't belong anywhere and you feel like you're an alien or something, and she said, I saw you yesterday and I see that you found your people.
Oh,
that's what she said.
Your wife told you that?
Yeah. 12 years.
You've been married 12 years?
Yeah,
Sweet young lady. Blanca?
Yeah, Blanca.
Now, what's your thoughts on what she shared with you?
Well, that's absolutely correct. That's totally correct. And, you know, I just feel like I've been, you know, in kind of an ectopic, you know, I didn't realize it, but I'm very much multicultural in a New Orleans sense, I think, you know. I mean, there's a lot of things that where I'm not going to fit in a lot of places, you know, and but New Orleans really seems to be a good fit for me in many ways.
Okay, well, how is that?
Well, just because, you know, it's there's a strong African root, obviously, you know, and I think it's very multicultural. This is a place where, you know, the French have been and the Spanish has been. You know, I've always been attracted to the Caribbean as well, and so there's a lot of those roots. And of course, you know, this has been the bulk of my mother's work, you know, so she connects me to this. And like I said, I see this as the place where the rest of the United States, where black culture in the United States have come from, this area, you know. So it connects me in important ways that I've been disconnected before. Like I said, I've always been sort of an outsider and margin in the margin. Nobody can put me in this box or that box, you know. But you keep doing that enough, and you start to feel like you don't belong anywhere. And you know, and you know, I think
that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, yeah. And
so you isolate yourself
at some point
from the world.
Yeah, and so
unconsciously.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And you know, as a child and as a teenager, you're trying to fit into the world somehow, you know, and I had to find my way without letting anybody put me in this box or the other box. And that was not an easy thing. You can see I dropped out of high school. I did all these things. You know, like I said, I tried to fail, whatever. And I put myself in the box, in the medicine box. You know, that worked for whatever reason for a while, you know, but it didn't get me around. You know, all it did was delay, you know, it had to still happen, you know. And so I realized that this is a lot more where I fit. You know, so it feels good.
So coming to New Orleans, did you expect or anticipate this vibe happening?
I didn't.
Or you just come to take care of something on behalf of your mom and get on back to business?
Yeah, I thought I was just closing something out that needed to happen with mom, and I found something else, which I think is really important. And you know, and it's complicated. The history is complicated because you saw how this was with my parents and my mom's family, who you know, were very progressive in their way, but they were not that progressive. You know, so when I was born, it's like I was not necessarily the person who was welcome here, you know. So I had to deal with that, you know. And so you know, to me, New Orleans was a place where my grandparents and my mom's family was, but they was not a part of that. I wasn't a part of that, and so they didn't
really accept you.
I can't say that they accepted me. I can't. As a child, I can't say I felt that at all.
Because you didn't. And that's probably why she didn't bring you here that regular.
Right. I mean.
Did you spend much time here at all?
Hardly. I think I was here twice, up till the age of 20, and it was not a comfortable experience.
So you didn't know your mom, mother, and father. You didn't know them that well.
And I saw them. They came to visit us a few times in Mexico, but these were not good interactions. You know, this was not like warm, fuzzy, cookies from grandma interactions.
They're Germans. They're German? Your mom was a German?
No, Russian and...
Your mom was Russian?
Russian and Polish. Oh. I mean, my grandfather was Polish and my grandmother was Russian. Jews, yeah.
The Russian Jews.
Right, and Polish Jews. So they came over. And they were part of this merchant class here.
Business people.
Yeah,
Matter of fact,
and they they had to work their ass off too, and they came from pretty austere, difficult backgrounds, So they were, I mean, from what I can see, they were like the people who, they would make suits for black people, and they would help them they'd help them deal with the legal stuff because they were lawyers, and the other Gentiles wouldn't have anything to do with black people, and so there was just that thing. But it's a different thing when you bring this big black political character into your life, like my dad. That's like, okay, that's a bit too much, I mean, at least, and to some extent, these, I think that they were trying to assimilate into the society somehow or another, and this was sort of a big, fly in the ointment. So I never felt a part of it, and and I couldn't think about New Orleans without thinking about how I didn't fit there because of that. But now, all that layer of people are all gone. And so, and suddenly I'm the patriarch. Like, what the hell? Right?
What's going on?
Yeah, it's like, wow.
It's like, Mama Gia, what the hell going on?
Yeah, it's kind of spin my head a little bit, So that's kind of nice, So I'm going to come back more.
But
I found a little apartment
it
even.
It brought some, what you call that again? Some relief, and you didn't come here only because of what the little memories you had back in the back of your mind, and so that kept you away. Now you're here, where your mom grew up and spent a lot of her time in writing and work, and you finally connecting to it.
Yeah. This gives me, the whole situation has changed.
Wouldn't expected this.
No, I wasn't quite expecting that. So that's great.
So that's
yeah, that feels good because, I mean, I'm not a kid anymore. I don't know if you noticed, but
you're just a 6-7-year-old child.
So I'm still like, are you my mama? Is this my home? I'm still like, just I lived all these different places. I never found a,
I know that goes deeper than
yeah. So it's a big.
On top of what happened between your grandparents.
Yeah. So I've been a refugee, really. You
really are a migrant worker.
Yeah, refugee and migrant worker. And I'd laugh about it. Like that's just the way I am. But but migrant from where? Where? And now I realize that New Orleans is really where a lot of what I am somehow came from, and I just hadn't really been able to connect to it.
But you can feel the energy of the people.
Oh yeah, and I just love it, and I love the music and the art, and it's very cultural. And what's one of the things I like about Mexico? It's very cultural, and there's all these, murals and stuff, and all these things that happen, and that's so
wait till you experience the Mardi Gras.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
no, but you really gonna be at home.
Yeah.
Like I'm not get you away from it.
I've not really seen that, and I went to the Blues and Jazz Festival once, but again, I'm just like that body armor that I had, just kept me from really letting, I mean, I couldn't really connect as much as I feel like I can now. So that gives me another thing to do. So that's cool. Yeah. So you thought this interview was over a half hour ago, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, no. It's gotta go.
Can you just give us a brief synopsis of your mom's involvement with the Deacons of Defense?
Which was right down the street from where you're at now.
Is that right?
Deacon for Defense.
So I don't know that much about that per se. I know that my mom and dad worked on some publications in Soul Book. I don't know if you know about that. Yeah. So, and that was very much, things that were circulated in the Bay Area around the time of the Black Panther Party formation that reflected a lot of the self-defense, self-determination and self-defense. To me, the Deacons of the Deacons for Defense was part of that. I'm not sure which came first or what, you know.
So they were in this area.
They're in this area, right. So I can't say specifically, you know. I'm gonna have to learn a lot more.
Well, you be coming home more regular now.
Yeah.
Welcome home, my brother.
Yeah, thank you.
You had to go all the way around the world and come back to Louisiana.
Yeah, that's
To
interesting.
the down home blues.
It's crazy.
Now you see why they were singing the blues.
Yeah. You know, I have medical licenses in 18 different states, and I don't have one here. And part of it's because my telemedicine activity, you know.
But you can still practice medical in Louisiana for what you do.
Well, you know, I'm interested in like healthcare systems now. You know, it's not like
Systems.
so
Yeah,
much.
you
It's
need
not
the
so much
system.
me
Working
taking.
at a hospital, you want to deal with the whole system.
Yeah, I want to, you know, figure out how to get healthcare to people in a new way, because what we've done doesn't work very well. So.
What is that new way? What's your idea for the new
Well,
way?
I mean, it's, you know, the telemedicine is a part of that. There's digital health stuff. People, you know, you now can have access to applications. Your phones can take your pulse and your heart rate and your oxygen saturation. There's remote patient monitoring that can be done in different ways. Some of this had to do with my mom, you know, taking care of her. I had to literally take care of her off the grid. So I learned how to do certain things, and you know, things that might have normally been done in a hospital. I think people, you know, there's so much, you know, centralization and bricks and mortar when it comes to healthcare, and it really, I think that the technology is getting to the point where it's getting, you know, there's the possibility of more decentralized care and more personalized care, and it's not so much like the radio station that's broadcasting out healthcare. You know, it's now everybody can, you can kind of build it around people's interests and their own responsibility as much as possible, and still have the community perspective. So it's a whole nother world out there. I need another 30 years to do this, but
You just like your mom.
yeah, well, you know, my mom
like your
encouraged
mom.
me for all this digital health stuff, and she helped me get some
That's
training
right.
in
She
some
was already-
areas.
she already
But I mean,
advanced.
but she saw what I was doing, and she said, you know, and I thought this was very interesting. She said, you know, it's the last third of your life where you're going to make the biggest impact. You know, so, you know, and I just went into my
Hope for you, Doc.
just went into my 60s. Yeah, there's no concept of retirement in my family.
Okay.
My mom, my dad, you know, they didn't prepare me for the concept of retirement. It's like if you think you have to retire, you've been doing the wrong thing.
I was just wondering if you had worked with any traditional healers in Mexico, if you've ever incorporated any of their things in your practice or brought them in to, you know, collaborate with them.
We've done some important work with midwives, traditional midwives, and this was around emergency obstetrics and with the idea of decreasing maternal mortality rates. In Chiapas, Mexico, probably 70% of the childbirths are done by traditional midwives. So now, but what we've taught is some very technical things on how to recognize certain kind of red flags, and most importantly, I think we've brought them together with people in the health ministry so that if something goes wrong, they feel comfortable communicating and helping to follow through on the care of these patients, because they were typically so marginalized that if something went wrong, they wouldn't be able to connect to the rest of the healthcare system, and the woman would die, you know?
Yes.
So you know, I said I'm an emergency medicine doctor, so I'm really kind of nuts and bolts about, you know, specific things that can be done to help people in certain cases. You know, as far as, you know, the kind of the, you know, the like the naturalistic healthcare or the kind of there's a lot of care that I consider kind of a wellness care and wellness behavior and those things, which I think are very important for people's health.
Yes. So like a holistic view of health.
Yeah. So I think that is for me, that's wellness. That I put that in the wellness category.
Okay.
You know, but like I said, I'm an emergency medicine doctor, so I'm like the the car accidents, the the gunshot wounds, the the heart attacks, and there's so I don't incorporate any of those things into that practice. This is kind of, you were asking me about toxicology, detoxing. It's like, for me, detoxing is a very concrete thing. It's like,
not nutritional.
yeah, I mean, it's not a nutritional thing. Now, anybody who's involved in a whole variety of different wellness activities is going to be healthier just because they're involved in their healthcare. And I can't tell you that, yoga or Tai Chi or this or that or the other thing is going to make a difference. That it's specific, but I can tell you that all of those things help people. Mm-hmm. So if you think it helps you, then that's what you need to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you have the community centers that work with people? Traditional healers, that is.
I think it is important to say that people often use traditional healers, and they use traditional herbs and those kinds of things, and some of those things are quite bioactive. I mean, they definitely have some effect,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's a mistake to dismiss all of those things. I mean, you have to realize that people may be taking certain things, and some of those things may be active. But we've had, and when you're dealing with patients, if you don't understand some of those relationships, then you can't really provide the care that you need to. So, in Mexico, they have very specific, very cultural things, that illnesses and things that they reference, and they don't fit neatly into the Western concept of what those things are. But you
right.
So part of what we do with the Med Spanish program is we introduce the docs to the types of things that the Mexican patients might be doing and what they're thinking about. And
right.
They've done some studies where they they interview the doctor and they interview the patient about what the problem was, and it's like, they're like on a completely different planet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, the doctor says, well, it's a headache syndrome, whatever, and the patient says, it was an evil eye.
Right.
And
sometimes it may take a combination of things from the quote-unquote orthodox physician and the quote-unquote traditional
well,
physician.
there's a spiritual aspect of healing and
Mm-hmm.
wellness that is definitely there, and
Right.
and you, in a lot of ways, you can't complete things without trying to close that,
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
it may mean, I mean, in a lot of ways, the Western medical model is very mechanical. It's mechanics, it's not so spiritual, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if people have this spiritual orientation, then you have to say, well, we've taken care of this mechanical part, and now
You have
the
to do the
rest of it,
rest.
you're going to work your way through it,
Yeah.
and you acknowledging that, I think, is very important. But as far as putting it into the system, the care that we provide, I mean, I'll send you a little video so you can see what we're talking about. I mean, these are nuts and bolts,
Right.
Things. All the stuff I just lived through last month.
Mm-hmm.
It's the, it's a very specific thing.
Yeah.
You can do all of the right mechanical things, and the patient just crashes and burns because of I don't know what.
Yes.
And then we have other people who are not supposed to be walking around and seem to be doing completely well.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I had my last shift was crazy. I had somebody who was literally, they were just basically as close to death as you can be, and all of their lab values looked normal.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this has got to be somebody else's. It's got to be this other guy, because he really looked terrible, but he went out to smoke, and I was like,
What is happening here?
I got a call from the ICU saying, you have to intubate this guy and put him on a ventilator. I said, he went out to smoke. I am not going to intimate somebody who went out to smoke. Yeah. So, but yeah. So there's all this. There's a whole bunch of other stuff there. But I understand that aspect of it. It's just that, it's not something I integrate much into what I'm. Yeah. Well, what I really want to do is to be able to help in this area of emergency obstetrics.
Mm-hmm.
We train people at all levels. It's kind of like a chain of survival strategy, So,
Mm-hmm.
but we try to get them on the same page about specific types of problems. And, it's obviously kind of a Western approach to, these interventions.
Yeah.
But
Necessary. Oh. Wow. Yes, indeed.
all right. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is
Yeah.
wonderful.
I appreciate that.
Man can shackle the hand, the man can shackle the feet, but only you can shackle the mind. The mind is always free to travel wherever you dare to take it. Welcome to Count Time.